Jonathan Parker was a 38-year-old architect living in the heart of Seattle, Washington. For years he had meticulously built his career, pouring his heart and soul into every project. His reputation as a thoughtful, patient, and detail-oriented professional had earned him respect in his field. Outside of work, Jonathan was a quiet, introspective man who found peace in the simple things. A warm cup of coffee in the morning, the stillness of the evening, and the company of his wife, Laura. Laura was 34, a smart, ambitious, and highly social woman. As a marketing manager at a leading tech company, she was driven, always on the move, and a natural when it came to building connections. Jonathan and Laura met at a design conference, where Laura's sharp intellect and infectious enthusiasm captured Jonathan's attention from the moment they crossed paths. They quickly became inseparable, their connection deepening as they shared dreams and passions. Their life together seemed like a dream. They bought a large house in a quiet neighborhood, a peaceful haven away from the bustle of the city. The house was a reflection of their personalities, modern, sleek, and full of potential for the future. They talked about having children one day, about building a family and a life that felt as perfect as the house they lived in. But life, as it often does, began to throw challenges their way. Jonathan's career demands increased as he was entrusted with larger and more complex projects. The late nights at the office grew longer, and the weekends were often consumed by site visits and client meetings. Meanwhile, Laura's career took off as well. She was promoted to a senior position at her company, which meant more responsibilities, more travel, and more late nights spent away from home. At first, they adapted. Laura's travels were often followed by stories of exciting meetings and new connections. Jonathan would listen attentively, happy to hear about her successes, though he couldn't shake the feeling that their conversations were becoming less frequent and more surface level. But they both believed in the strength of their bond, confident that their love would withstand the strain of their busy careers. But as the months passed, their once vibrant connection began to fade. Laura's work took her out of town more often, and when she was home, she seemed distant. She was always tired, always preoccupied. Jonathan tried to be understanding, but he couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in her behavior. She was no longer the woman he had met at the conference, the woman who could talk for hours about her passions and ideas. Instead, she had become quiet, retreating into herself when she returned from her trips. Jonathan tried to push the unease aside. He trusted Laura and he believed in their marriage. Yet with each passing day the space between them seemed to grow wider. He began to spend more time in his own world, immersed in his work, while Laura did the same, retreating into hers. It was as if they were living parallel lives, close in proximity but miles apart in their hearts. Their relationship, once so full of promise, now felt fragile, as if a crack had formed between them and they were both too afraid to acknowledge it. Still, they carried on, pretending that everything was fine, hoping that the love they shared would be enough to hold it all together. One evening, after a particularly long week of stressful meetings, Jonathan decided to surprise Laura. He left work early and made his way home, planning a quiet, romantic dinner for just the two of them. He imagined the look of surprise and delight on her face when she walked through the door. The idea brought a rare smile to his face as he pulled into the driveway. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by silence. The house, usually filled with laughter or the hum of conversation, was eerily still. Jonathan frowned. He called out for Laura, but there was no answer. A cold feeling spread through him as he made his way into the living room, expecting to find her there, maybe reading or relaxing after a long day. But instead what he saw shocked him to his core. Laura was sitting on the couch with another man. The man was Ben, a colleague from her company. Jonathan recognized him immediately. Ben was often mentioned in Laura's stories about her work. But the sight of them together, sitting so close, talking in hushed voices, made Jonathan's stomach churn. They didn't notice him at first, and he stood there frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. When they finally looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, everything seemed to freeze in time. Ben stood up quickly, his face flushed, and muttered an awkward apology before rushing out of the house without another word. The tension in the room was unbearable. Laura, on the other hand, looked terrified. Her face turned pale and her eyes widened with fear. She tried to speak but faltered, her words caught in her throat. Jonathan's mind raced. What was happening? Why was Ben here? His thoughts tumbled over each other in confusion and disbelief. Then Laura finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan, she began, her eyes filling with tears, I need to tell you something. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He felt like the world was slipping away from him. He was not prepared for the words that would follow. Laura confessed. She told him that she and Ben had been involved in a romantic relationship for the past few months, their affair starting innocently enough but evolving into something deeper. She spoke about the moments they shared, the secrets they kept, and the emotional connection that had developed between them. Jonathan's world shattered as he listened. His mind couldn't process what he was hearing. The woman he loved, the woman he had trusted, had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. Jonathan stood there paralyzed. His heart was breaking, his mind racing. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. All the years of trust, the promises they had made to each other, seemed meaningless now. He had been living a lie. The life he had so carefully built was crumbling in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Laura reached out to him, her voice pleading for forgiveness. But Jonathan couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He just stared at her, his heart aching with a pain he had never known. His world had been upended, and he didn't know how to find his footing again. As Laura continued to speak, Jonathan's mind went blank. He didn't want to hear any more. The betrayal was too much to bear. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, the weight of his heartbreak too heavy to carry. The next few days were a blur for Jonathan. His mind raced with a storm of emotions: hurt, confusion, anger, and disbelief. He couldn't escape the image of Laura sitting on the couch with Ben, their closeness, their secret. Every corner of the house felt like a reminder of what had been shattered. The home that had once been a sanctuary for him now felt cold and foreign. He avoided Laura as much as possible. She tried to reach out, to apologize, to explain herself, but Jonathan couldn't bear to hear it. How could he? How could he listen to the woman who had just confessed to betraying him in the worst way? He couldn't wrap his mind around it, let alone his heart. He needed space. He needed time to process everything, but mostly he needed to escape from the constant reminder of the life that had just been ripped from him. For the first time in years, Jonathan took a break from work. His clients could wait. His projects could wait. He needed time to think, to grieve, and to figure out what his life would look like now. The days felt long and the nights were even longer. He found himself staring at the ceiling for hours, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him. Every minute felt like a lifetime. Laura was still in the house, but she was a shadow of the woman Jonathan had once known. She had moved into the guest room, but Jonathan could feel her presence, her sorrow, her regret. She would occasionally knock on his door asking to talk, but he refused. He wasn't ready. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. One morning, after several sleepless nights, Jonathan decided he couldn't stay there anymore. He packed a small bag, grabbed his keys, and left. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay in the place that had once been filled with love and now only reminded him of his broken heart. He drove aimlessly around Seattle, the city he had called home for so many years, but it felt foreign to him now. Everything seemed to remind him of Laura. He passed the cafe they used to visit every Sunday, the park where they had taken long walks, the street corner where they had shared their first kiss. All of it was gone. All of it felt tainted. Eventually, he found himself at the edge of the city, by the water, where he used to go when he needed solitude. It was quiet here, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore providing some comfort amidst the chaos in his mind. Jonathan sat on a bench, watching the horizon, but he couldn't focus. His thoughts kept returning to Laura. What had happened? How had things gone so wrong? He thought back to the last few months, the distance between them, the missed calls, the late nights, the lies. He had seen the signs, hadn't he? The way Laura would come home late, looking tired and distracted. The way she started spending more time with her friends, when she was in town. But he had dismissed it all. He had trusted her, trusted that the love they had built would be enough. Now it all seemed so naive. Jonathan let out a long, shaky breath and buried his face in his hands. How had he not seen this coming? Was he so wrapped up in his own work that he had ignored the cracks forming in their relationship? He had been too focused on his career, too focused on building the life they had, while she had been building a life of her own behind his back. He had to stop thinking like this. He couldn't change what had happened. All he could do now was figure out how to move forward. But how? After a long time, Jonathan stood up from the bench and walked along the shore, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He had no answers, no plan. All he knew was that he couldn't keep running from the reality of his situation. He needed to face it, to confront Laura and figure out what was next. But before that, he needed to make a decision. He couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Later that day, Jonathan made a call to a lawyer. He didn't know exactly what he needed or how the process worked, but he knew that he couldn't go back to the life he had with Laura. The trust was gone, and without trust, there was nothing. The pain of betrayal was too deep to ignore. It was time to face the truth. Their marriage was over. The lawyer's office was cold and sterile, but it provided Jonathan with some sense of control. For the first time since the revelation, he felt like he was taking action, making decisions instead of being carried along by the current of his emotions. The lawyer listened patiently as Jonathan recounted the details of his situation, and when Jonathan was finished, the lawyer spoke, outlining the next steps. Jonathan took mental notes, his mind still numb but beginning to accept the reality of what was coming. It felt strange to be making plans for a future without Laura, but Jonathan knew it was the only way forward. There was no going back. He had to protect himself now, even if it meant letting go of everything he had once thought he wanted. As he left the lawyer's office, the weight of the situation settled in. He had just started the process of ending his marriage, the life he had spent years building, but deep down he knew it was the right decision. The trust was broken, and without it, there was no foundation left. The next few days were filled with paperwork and phone calls, the legal process moving forward quickly. Jonathan couldn't believe how fast everything was happening. It felt like his life was moving in fast forward while he was stuck in slow motion. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. He had made his choice and now there was no turning back. When he finally spoke to Laura, it wasn't with the anger he thought he would feel. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there was just a quiet, painful acknowledgement of what had happened. Laura begged for forgiveness, but Jonathan couldn't give it to her. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The divorce proceedings were swift. Laura accepted the terms without protest, even though it was clear she was devastated. The life they had built together was now just a collection of broken pieces. As Jonathan signed the final papers, he felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. He had survived the betrayal, but at what cost? In the days following the divorce, Jonathan felt a strange combination of emptiness and relief. The finality of the proceedings should have brought him peace, but instead, it left him with a haunting silence that lingered long after the papers were signed. The home he had shared with Laura no longer felt like his own. The furniture, the pictures, the very walls seemed to whisper of the life they once had, and Jonathan was left to sift through the rubble of their shattered dreams. Laura, for her part, had attempted to reach out on multiple occasions. She sent him messages, letters, even called, hoping for some chance at reconciliation, but Jonathan remained steadfast in his decision. It wasn't out of anger, at least not entirely. It was because he knew he could never trust her again. The foundation of their relationship had been cracked beyond repair. The betrayal was too deep, the emotional scars too fresh. He couldn't pretend that everything could be fixed with a few apologies. But even as Jonathan stood firm, a part of him felt the weight of the brokenness in his heart. It was hard not to wonder what went wrong. Where had their connection been lost? Was there something he missed along the way? The questions gnawed at him, pulling him into long nights of contemplation. He hadn't realized how much of his identity had been wrapped up in his life with Laura. Now that it was gone, he felt adrift, like a man without a compass in a sea of confusion. Despite the emotional turmoil, Jonathan tried to focus on his work. It had always been his refuge, his safe space, and he hoped it could offer some semblance of normalcy during this chaotic time. He threw himself into his architectural projects, pushing himself harder than ever before. It was a welcome distraction and for a while it worked. The design of a new office complex, a luxury apartment building. Each project offered a new challenge, a new vision to work toward. It was a way for him to prove that he could rebuild, even if it was just his career. At the office, his colleagues noticed the change in him. Jonathan, who had once been the quiet, reserved professional, was now sharper, more focused. He worked tirelessly, meeting deadlines, bringing new ideas to the table. But there was a certain emptiness to it, something missing beneath the surface. His passion for architecture had always been driven by the joy of creation, but now it was more about survival, keeping busy so that he wouldn't have to confront the pain. One evening, after a long day of meetings and sketches, Jonathan decided to take a walk around the city. The streets of Seattle, once familiar and comforting, now seemed foreign to him. It was as if the city had changed along with his life. He wandered aimlessly, not caring where he went, his mind lost in a fog of regret and loneliness. It was during these walks that the weight of his loss hit him the hardest, when he wasn't distracted by work or the business of daily life. As he walked past a cafe they used to frequent, Jonathan's heart twisted. He could almost see Laura sitting there, her bright smile lighting up the room, her animated conversations pulling him in. He could still remember how they would sit for hours talking about everything and nothing at all. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago. The loneliness crept in, seeping into the spaces he tried to keep occupied. Jonathan had always prided himself on his independence, but now, in the silence of his apartment, He felt the absence of Laura more deeply than ever. It wasn't just the loss of a partner, it was the loss of the life he thought they would build together. It was the loss of trust, of love, and of a shared future. Still, as the days passed, Jonathan found himself slowly adjusting. The constant ache in his chest began to fade, though it never completely disappeared. He started meeting new people. Casual acquaintances at first, people he could talk to without the pressure of emotional baggage. Some of them were colleagues, others were new faces in the city, but each encounter, no matter how small, reminded him that life, despite its cruelty, continued on. One person in particular made a surprising impact on him. Her name was Rachel, a fellow architect who worked at a rival firm. They had crossed paths at a few industry events, but their interactions had always been brief and professional. After the divorce, Rachel had reached out to Jonathan, offering support, though in a way that didn't feel overbearing. It was simple: a cup of coffee, a few words of encouragement, a shared understanding of the pressure that came with their line of work. It didn't take long for them to develop a friendship, though Jonathan never considered it anything more. At first, he wasn't sure if he was ready to open himself up to someone else, but over time, Rachel's genuine kindness began to ease some of the walls Jonathan had built around his heart. She didn't push him to talk about his past, but when he did, she listened without judgment. Her presence was calming, and her advice, always measured and thoughtful, helped Jonathan regain some sense of balance. Yet, despite the growing friendship with Rachel, Jonathan wasn't ready to move on. He wasn't sure he ever would be. He still saw flashes of Laura in his mind, moments of happiness and connection that felt so real, so vivid, that they almost seemed like memories from another lifetime. Jonathan didn't want to erase those memories, they were part of who he was. But he also knew he couldn't live in the past. The present, though painful, demanded his attention. Rachel, sensing the turmoil that still lingered in Jonathan's heart, didn't push for anything more. She was content to offer him her support, to be a friend when he needed one. Slowly but surely, Jonathan began to accept that the past, while it would always be a part of him, didn't have to define him. He was allowed to move forward, to build a new version of his life, even if that meant doing it one step at a time. But the true test, Jonathan realized, was still ahead. Healing didn't happen overnight. It was a journey, one that required more than just time. It required the willingness to face the pain, to confront the reality of what had happened, and to forgive himself and eventually Laura. But for now, Jonathan wasn't ready to take that step. He needed more time, more space to figure out who he was without her. As the days stretched into weeks, Jonathan continued to rebuild his life bit by bit. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Months passed since Jonathan's divorce, and though the pain of his past still lingered, he had begun to carve out a new existence for himself. The quiet routine of his days, work, the occasional coffee with Rachel, long walks in the city, had provided some semblance of normalcy. But every so often, the emptiness would return, reminding him that healing wasn't a linear process. The road to recovery was jagged, with ups and downs that seemed to come out of nowhere. Work continued to be his anchor. His projects grew more ambitious, more complex. Jonathan had found solace in architecture again, in the way it allowed him to create something tangible, something lasting. It was a way for him to channel the energy that had once been consumed by his marriage into something that could withstand time. He worked late into the nights, perfecting designs, meeting clients, and overseeing construction. The world of blueprints, scale models, and site visits became his refuge. But even within this world, he felt the void. The absence of someone to share his triumphs and frustrations with, the lack of a hand to hold after a long day. He had begun to realize how much of himself he had invested in his marriage with Laura. All those years had been spent building a life for two, and now he was alone, trying to rebuild from the wreckage. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Jonathan had been on site, inspecting the progress of a new building he was designing, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an unknown number, but something about it made him answer. On the other end was a voice he recognized immediately. "Jonathan, it's Laura." He felt his breath catch in his throat. Hearing her voice after so many months of silence sent a flood of memories rushing back, of their time together, of the life they once shared, and of the pain that had followed. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. "Laura," Jonathan said, his voice strained. "What is it?" I need to talk to you," she said, her voice soft, filled with regret. "Can we meet? Please." Jonathan hesitated. He wasn't sure he was ready for this, wasn't sure he wanted to open old wounds. But he couldn't deny that part of him had always wondered how she was, what her life was like now. "Okay," he finally said, his voice a little firmer than he felt. Where? They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe, one that Jonathan had passed countless times on his walks around the city. It was the same cafe where they had spent countless mornings sipping coffee and making plans for the future. It was strange, almost fitting that they would meet there, in a place that had once been full of joy but now felt like a symbol of everything they had lost. When Jonathan arrived, Laura was already there, sitting at a table by the window. She looked different. Older, perhaps, but still the same woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple black dress, a far cry from the high-powered marketing executive she had once been. As he sat down across from her, there was an awkward silence between them, one that neither of them seemed to know how to break. Jonathan could see the tears in her eyes, the remnants of guilt and sorrow that she couldn't hide. "I didn't expect you to call," Jonathan said, finally breaking the silence. "I didn't think you'd want to talk to me again." "I didn't either," Laura replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to say some things, Jonathan. Things that have been eating at me." Jonathan took a deep breath. He had spent months wrestling with his emotions, with the pain of betrayal and the anger that still lingered in his heart. But he was tired. Tired of carrying that weight, tired of the silence. Perhaps this was the moment when he could finally start letting go. "Okay," he said, his voice calm but steady. "Say what you need to say." Laura looked down at her hands, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could handle everything, work, our relationship, all of it. But I wasn't being honest with myself, and I certainly wasn't being honest with you. When I started spending more time with Ben, it felt like an escape from everything. I convinced myself that I deserved it, that I could keep both lives separate. But I couldn't. And I hurt you in the process." Jonathan sat quietly, absorbing her words. He wanted to be angry, to lash out at her for everything she had done, but he knew that wouldn't help. The pain was too deep for that. What he needed more than anything was closure. A chance to understand why this had happened, even if he couldn't ever forgive it. "I was selfish," Laura continued, her voice trembling. "I thought I could have it all, that I could juggle everything without consequences. But I hurt you and I hurt myself. I've spent months regretting what I did, regretting that I ruined something so beautiful." Jonathan felt a pang in his chest as he listened. The weight of her words was heavy, but it wasn't the guilt he had once hoped to hear. It was something else, an acknowledgement of the brokenness between them, of the irreparable damage caused by lies and deceit. "I know I can't change what happened," Laura added, "but I need you to know how sorry I am. I ruined everything, Jonathan, and I've been living with that guilt every single day." For a moment Jonathan said nothing. He just stared at her, taking in her words, her face. He had loved her once. He had trusted her with everything he had. But the truth was, their love wasn't enough to survive the betrayal. "I wish I could forgive you, Laura," Jonathan said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You broke something in me that I can't fix." Laura nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand. I needed you to know." Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't sure where this conversation would leave him. Maybe it would bring some peace, or maybe it would only deepen the ache. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He didn't have to carry her mistakes anymore. As they parted ways, Jonathan felt the quiet settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but it was his to walk. One step at a time.